TenZ is possibly the most acclaimed player in the history of Valorant, but with fame comes criticism. In recent years, many have criticized that the Canadian player is terribly overrated, although, at the same time, he can be one of the most loved throughout the scene. In this video, I will document his career, his achievements, and his defeats, so that you can come to the conclusion that you consider appropriate. Is TenZ a legend or a failure? TenZ Van Ngo, of Vietnamese origins, born in Canada, whom we met for speaking his legend from very early on in CSGO, at just 15 years old, he took his first steps in mixed teams and small organizations of his native Canada, gradually making his name reach higher. However, it was not until the fall of 2019 when Cloud9, one of the most powerful esports organizations to date, did with his services, consuming what for many had been a secret for several years. TenZ had wood to be one of the best in the world. However, it was impossible for the day to know that CSGO was not going to be the place where TenZ reached the highest. After what would be a bad year for him at a competitive level in Counter-Strike, TenZ decided to enter again in a brave movement to lead his career to another shooter that had especially caught his attention: Valorant. But with the game just released, the road was not as easy as it seemed. Although a contract in Cloud9, and with the uncertainty about Valorant, would be a good place to nest, TenZ debated whether to be a streamer full-time or to compete again in this new game that had just come out, and from the first moment, already captured a large part of the eyes of the whole world for its incredible game mechanics. Remember that Cloud9, although right now it is one of the most powerful organizations in North America when it comes to Valorant, may not have placed as much trust in the game as TenZ would have liked at the time. And after a few tournaments in Valorant's beta, with derisory prizes for a player who was used to the first competitive level of Counter-Strike, the doubts were back in his head. Especially after the great failure in Valorant's first official tournament, First Strike, where Cloud9 achieved a regrettable 8th place. TenZ, once again, entered the debate loop if he should stay as a streamer, or dedicate himself full-time to pursue his competitive dream. Ending the last days of 2020, TenZ publicly declared that he was taking a little break because he needed time to think about his future, being temporarily relegated to the team's bench. Over time, he stated that he had sat on the bench because he felt that he was the only one who wanted to discuss with the team, that his playstyle was not good, and that nothing would come if a player on the team did not believe in his own system. The spring of 2021 begins with news that shakes the world. TenZ is loaned by Cloud9 to play in Sentinels. Why? Well, do you remember the Sinatra case? Don't worry, we'll make a video. But in short, after the cancellation of Sinatra, a player from Sentinels, the developer of Valorant Riot and his own team, they drastically separated him from the competitive system of the game. The North American team was forced to replace him, asking Cloud9 for TenZ's transfer to take his place. This was a movement highly commented by the community, and that was in everyone's mouth. Everyone knew about TenZ's skills, and that Cloud9 was not enough to develop his talent. But he was no less than the prodigy of Sinatra. How would he fit the pieces? In March, the first Master of 2021 begins. Remember that the first Master was not an event between different regions, but one for each region. The feelings could not be better, and Sentinels did not lose a single game and were crowned as the champions of the VCT NA Masters, in a final that was 3-0 against FaZe. Individually, TenZ raked almost perfection in that tournament, with more than 283 average combat damage and 1.45 ratio. Casualties against deaths. TenZ had just arrived at the team, had managed to take the first Master of the year, and nothing more and nothing less than obtaining the MVP of the tournament. The Masters ended in April 2021 and the North American League begins, the Challengers, which gave way to the next Masters, Masters of Reykjavik. They qualified excessively, since throughout the season they won 19 games and only lost twice. Against Build by Gamers and Anbox with Jay. TenZ seemed to fit perfectly into his new team, adapting the roles of Jett, Reyna, and Raze, and although he played extremely well, it cannot be denied that during this season, perhaps his teammate Sick had a little more prominence in individual statistics. Anyway, the new Sentinels were scary. Master Reykjavik arrives in June, and the expectations and confrontations were very high. It was the first really international event in the history of Valorant. For the first time, the different regions faced each other in a face-to-face event to see who was the best, and the grand final was one of the hardest, most remembered and mythical in the history of Valorant. Sentinels or Fnatic, North America or Europe. In a much more tight-fitting final than what might seem seen from the outside, they reached overtime on 2 occasions, and the last map was decided by a 1311. Sentinels beat Fnatic in a 30, crowning themselves once again as the winner of the Master Reykjavik. A master that, meritocratically speaking, was worth much more than the previous one. But Sentinels won it without losing a single match. In fact, they didn't lose a single map. But how did TenZ do it individually? Well, it was simply the best event of his entire career. Seamless within the game, he played 3 agents throughout the tournament, Raze, Reyna, and Jhin. And he got 1.35 rating average, 290 score per combat average, and a ratio of 1.48 kill deaths. Of course, once again, TenZ was the MVP of the tournament. 3 days after winning his second master, Sentinels posted a tweet announcing TenZ's final signing. Yes, remember that until then, he was still in Cloud9's hands, and they paid him $1.25 million, one of the most expensive signings in the history of esports. TenZ signings seemed to be the signing of the year. The next few months were what is commonly known in Valorant as a walk through the American challengers. TenZ Sentinels destroyed all the teams in their path, although it is true that he was starting to give in from time to some maps, but without giving up by defeat. Nothing worrying. They were in very good shape for the next international event, the Master Berlin, to which they had already qualified. September arrived and with it, the Master Berlin. And all the analysts were already starting to talk about what would be known as the first hegemony implemented in Valorant, with a favorite Sentinels to win the third and last Master of that year. And surely, also the World Championship. But here would happen an absolutely unusual event for the history of Valorant, the first international defeat of TenZ Sentinels. But let me first give you a little context of the event. In this Master Berlin, another team had also been classified with a very large player base, and that was in everyone's mouth, Miswell's G2. Carlos Rodriguez Ocelote, who was CEO of G2 at the time, had been building, along with Sentinels, a quite spicy narrative, generating a lot of expectation for the game based on many tweets and beefs by both teams. In fact, G2 decided to add even more spice to the meeting by labeling Berlin, a city that, according to their opinion, belonged to G2, with posters in favor of G2 and against Sentinels, ending in a last masterful act with an advertising plane flying over the city of Berlin, with a sign in which you could clearly read the words, "Fuck Sentinels," for hours above the hotel where the American team members were staying. In addition, there was another latent narrative, not so present, and the confrontation of TenZ vs Mixwell. They knew each other from Counter-Strike, and it was the first time they could face each other. What a beautiful time. The reality is that regardless of the narrative, few thought that G2 could beat Sentinels. In fact, the first confrontation between them was Master Berlin Sentinels, and it ended up imposing itself, without many difficulties, in the 21 with a TenZ and SIG Stellar. However, it will be the second confrontation between them that will mark a milestone, as a point of inflection in the history of the American team. Sentinels, who had never lost a single international match in their history until then, let's remember that no one had managed to snatch a single match from them in any of the previous 2 Masters, lost against a G2 that surprised the world by imposing 2-0. TenZ suffered his first big puncture, playing in an official, throwing a rating of 0.76 in that match. And no, it's not that the Beast Tyson had a bad day, simply G2 didn't let him play. The result made social networks explode, especially against Zombs, a Sentinels player and a TenZ teammate who had a terrible performance. This match was important in TenZ's career as it ended mentally with the team's hegemony and showed the world that they also bled. In fact, very soon after, they would end up being mentally knocked out against the NVDJ 2-0 in a match that definitely eliminated them from the Master Berlin and where Tyson also did not find his comfort zone. In short, despite the fact that the Canadian player played at a great level throughout the tournament, scoring a 1.25 rating, he would have his first major clash in his second match against this G2, somewhat below the level that we were used to in that period of time. By December of that same year, the Valorant champions, the Valorant World Cup, arrived. Despite the defeat suffered in Berlin, many claimed that Sentinels was still the clear candidate to win the World Cup after a spectacular year. However, an underrated team by many, Crew, in their own Cinderella story, in one of the most exciting matches we have known in the Spanish-speaking community, finishing and eliminating a Sentinels from the World Cup, which was beginning to shake. They had lost in Champions against Liquid previously. TenZ, on a personal level, developed a good Champions and was, along with Shazam, the best player on the team. However, the year did not end in the best possible way. After winning 2 Masters and losing the third in playoffs, they were eliminated from the most important Valorant event to date. A bad way to say goodbye to what could have been the best year of their career. The year 2022 arrived, and although the first matches began with the TenZ in a very good state, with an average rating of 1.2, it quickly became clear that the team was not going through a good moment internally, and an important streak of defeats began to chain up, which in no way was accompanied by Tyson's individual performance, which began to decline gradually. Sentinels, for the first time in its history, was left out of the first international event, the 2022 Masters 1 Reykjavik. And allow me a little spoiler, 2 years will pass until TenZ can step foot again in an international event by classification. Yes, as you can hear, the non-classification to Masters was a very hard blow for the Canadian, who saw his colleague Jay from home, along with the best version of Optic, raise the cup for North America, while he was at home watching and transmitting the Masters, along with his partner, Hayade. But after the Masters, which they did not go to, things got even worse. TenZ possibly experienced one of the worst stages of performance in his entire career, and was starting to have trouble finding his antepens. In fact, in June, the worst game of TenZ took place. He entered in a non-documented so far, and nothing less than against his former team Cloud9. Very hard. There were many elements that failed to lead to this terrible streak of defeats and low performance. On the one hand, the meta began to change frivolously, and Chambers began to enter the scene abruptly. Sentinels took a long time to incorporate it, and made it rotating between Dark and Shazam without great success. Whatever TenZ was, he did not just take the step to use it. Perhaps it was due to the demand for a more paused, defensive and passive game methodology, which was more difficult than normal for TenZ, who had shown us his temerity and aggressiveness with very offensive agents such as Jet, Raze, and Reyna. In fact, it was especially curious that his fixation on Jet was increasingly evident, even reducing the peak of his agents compared to last year. But among the backstage there were more reasons that justified the low performance of Sentinels, as well as the multiple controversies that arose around the team, accompanied by constant changes in the lineup. The first figure to leave that core that had won the first and second Masters of the previous year was Zoms. A Zoms that not only had an intermittent performance, if I may say so, but was also involved in all kinds of controversies that slightly damaged the international image of the team, even reaching to label as shit less developed regions in Valorant, like Brazil, when facing them, which triggered all kinds of reactions against his image, ranging from scoundrels on Twitter to an Onur who, when asked about Sentinel's post-victory, responded directly to Thumbs, asking him what he thought about a less developed region, and in the hypershit. Onur's own words.
Y un saludo para Soms también, que creía, si Brasil era la región más triste del mundo, por no decir mierda, no me gusta esa palabra, nosotros estábamos en la hipermierda. Y la hipermierda, amigo, te mandó a casa.
¡A casa!
Because of all this, bad performance, controversies, hot tweets against Directive, and a presumption of internal toxicity that made everyone believe that it could be the cause of TenZ's bad performance and the rest of the team, Directive decided that the first change would be to remove Thumbs and put Kampeki for the second split. Unfortunately, the bad streak of results did not stop with the change that was insufficient to change the negative dynamics that was dragging the team. And with a second split, in which they could not win a single game of the 5 players, Sentinels was left out of the Copenhagen Masters and relegated to play the last chance qualifier to try to reach the World Cup. The last chance qualifier arrived in America, and there were 2 quite outstanding facts. The first is that TenZ finally took the step to play Chamber. And although he was seen at certain times the costumes of not having played a Chamber before, his performance was exceptionally good. The other outstanding fact was how the North American team surprised the world again with a fairly controversial and commented signing for the time. Sentinels would sign Shroud to play this last tournament that gave them the last chance to qualify for the World Cup. And he did it by benching Sick, who stated that he was going through a bad personal time and preferred to put himself aside. In fact, many of you will remember that Sick would go through a very bad moment, giving rise to several controversial events on social networks in which his own teammates, such as Shazam, would warn people that they ignored Sick since he was going through certain psychotic episodes that made him not be him. But what were the real reasons for Shroud's signing? Personally, I believe that it was a move meant for the content rather than an attempt to redeem his competitive year. It was a Shroud who, despite being one of the great names in the history of esports, had been out of competition for a long time, and Valorant represented a competitive field not very explored for him, beyond vague excursions. A Shroud who also started with an important pressure when he posed as the team's response to improve his performance in order to qualify for the World Cup. Finally, to the surprise of many and the annoyance of others, Sentinels with Shroud gave a much better face in the LCK than in the rest of the season, falling against the 100 Thieves that won that tournament. It is true that although Shroud's individual level presented quite a few irregularities, the team had a better face, but it was not enough to redeem his year. 2022 was coming to an end, and TenZ not only did not go to the Valorant World Cup for the second consecutive year, but he had also not attended any large-scale event in person. In 2023, and the Valorant franchise team system is established for the first season of the new format, he decided to sign several of the players from Loud, who at that time were the world champions, Sazi and Pancada. It was a controversial movement, since not all his fans in North America understood a movement in favor of internationalizing the roster, claiming that there was enough talent in North America to meet expectations. And additionally to what I mentioned earlier, there were many statements from ex-teammates that affirmed that Sazi had left the LAUD in very bad ways, and that he was a teammate who could be a little toxic. As if this were not enough, on the other hand, a much more direct and personal controversy arose. Shazam found out about his departure from Sentinels being live by a tweet published by the organization, generating countless tweets of support for him and rebuke to the team. Additionally, as Shazam himself commented later, his departure was not planned unless he knew it. In fact, his statements were made famous in his own live, where he confessed that he had agreed to play along with Shroud for the image of the team. to give fun content to the fanbase with the promise that he could continue in Sentinels the next season with a very good roster. Statements from Shazam that, although they have never been clarified who is right, the truth is that he did not continue in the team. All this made it evident that things internally in Sentinels had not been working very well. Anyway, the first year of franchises begins with the return of TenZ to the stages in an international event, after a year without playing one. The San Paulo lock-in arrives, and we will see TenZ against a Fnatic who was simply superior. We saw him reappear with a Jet and a Sage, and although he was by far the best of his team, he did not make one of those appearances that a star of his size needs. They were eliminated in the first game. And it is that the personal situation of TenZ during 2023 was very hard. On March 3rd, Kaede, his partner and also a streamer, announced on Twitter that he had been diagnosed with leukemia and that he would start a hard treatment in the next few weeks. After this, as is evident, TenZ's already worrying performance did not do but worsen, to the point that by the end of that same month, exactly on April 27th, and allegedly a finger injury, it is announced that they remove TenZ from the main roster and throw away the sixth player Marbet, known for his time in Optic, where he won a Master. There were 17 official days in which the Canadian was officially on the bench, observing how his teammates were still playing the regular phase of the American League. It is May 14th when TenZ returns to a regular league game, where despite being far from his best performance, he manages to beat Crew with a 2-0. It was again a year of absolute drought for Sentinels, where they could not replicate the success of 2021, without even qualifying for the Tokyo Master of 2023. All this forced them to participate in the LECQ that year. Although, because of a Crew that was in a state of grace, and a Leviathan, which did not want to give up, they did not have any kind of opportunity in a tournament that will always be marked in our memories by that painful final between the two teams of LATAM, giving everything to define who would reach the World Cup. The year 2024 arrives, and with it, the arc of redemption of TenZ, where the Canadian fans could affirm with total clarity, TenZ has returned. The year begins with a kickoff where Sentinels gives more than good feelings, qualifying for the first Master of the year with a result of 7 out of 9 games won, only losing to Lout and G2. A Lout that would give revenge in the grand final of the kickoff, and that classified them as S1 to Madrid. But perhaps the most exciting thing about this start of the season was for the first time seeing a TenZ totally reinvented. Far from the caper duelist that we all knew, a Tyson was observed with a much more support role, without ceasing to have the impact on the match that the public expected from him. A TenZ that was seen playing with agents that he had not played before. Agents like Yoru, KO, and even Omen. And forgive me this stop in boxes to refer to this Omen hybrid duelist that became canon thanks to Tyson in the kickoff of America. Able to fulfill his smoke fusion and generate constant opportunities through aggression and cunning, in addition to having a very significant impact on kills. In fact, TenZ was 6th in general in the kickoff, without taking the protagonist's agents that he had us accustomed, and with this Omen as his most played agent. The Master Madrid arrives, and finally, after 2 years, TenZ returns to step on an international event meritocratically. Remember that the lock-in of 2023 was of direct assistance for all teams, without any classification. The performance of the North American team during the Master was spectacular, with clear reminiscences of those who could see the Sentinel in 2021. A Sentinels that infused terror and force in each of the games it played, losing only once with Genji, and against those who would meet again in the final of the tournament. But if it was already a confrontation of two teams with a lot of level, there was more lore than some did not know. The event of the Master Madrid was a cross between two very important acts of redemption in the Valorant scene. On the one hand, we had the redemption of Tyson, who for 3 years had not been able to step on an international face-to-face event of this magnitude. And on the other hand, the Korean player Lakia, who had gone almost completely anonymous since 2021, going from being a stellar player in Newturn to a failed signing in Vision Strikers and starring a sad moment in his first face-to-face event in 2021. Both players struck swords in their own acts of redemption, in a final that was epic and very disputed, and that was defined by details, where TenZ took the best out of himself, leaving the honey in the mouth of those who still trusted that he had the wood to be the best in the world. TenZ won again. TenZ returned to a face-to-face event. TenZ raised a trophy again, and TenZ crowned a Master again after 3 years of playing. His third Master, and he was crowned as the player with the most Master titles in the world. The NA Masters 2021, the Reykjavik Masters 2021, and the Masters Madrid of 2024. After the Masters, the regular league of 2024 begins, and almost as due to the effect of gravity, things on the team don't work so well again. Sentinels win 3 games in a row, but also lose 3 more and are left out of the next international event, the Master Shanghai. However, TenZ plays at a stellar level in this phase, remaining top 3 in statistics in the league using Omen, KO, and Gecko. Undoubtedly, the only one who seemed to keep showing the face of a Masters champion team towards Omen. With the arrival of the second phase of the regular league, the team's performance was better than that of Stage 1, with a 41 draw and qualifying to the playoffs that gave way to the World Cup. TenZ continued with the same regularity in his level throughout 2024. Also finishing as one of the best players in the American League, without any doubt. And despite falling in the playoffs between 100 Thieves and a knockout round that practically left them without options, The fact that Leviathan qualified directly gave them the opportunity to qualify for the World Cup through the Champions points. These had been accumulated thanks to their games won during the league and for having won the Master Madrid. Tyson finally achieved what he had resisted for 3 years. He was finally going to the Valorant World Cup in 2024, and in a state very similar to his prime in 2021. Personally, I think that the history of TenZ is a captivating story. A person full of talent who knows what it is to be at the top, and also at the bottom, and who knows how to fight adversity, always showing a smile to his audience. A perfect example of how a professional should be. Although I must also confess that having them in the sports hall, I can consider that there are other figures that have caught my attention more. But what is absolutely undeniable is that their feats, and the ones that still remain to be achieved, will always be Valorant history. And tell me, what do you think? Failure or legend?